Welcome to Calumet Perspectives. It's a new season for our student-run, student-produced show that features scholars and researchers discussing their published work and their research work and how it relates to the world in which we live. My name is Lee Artz. I'm a professor of media studies here at Purdue Calumet and the host for today's show. My guest is Dr. David Detmer from the Department of Philosophy, an outstanding scholar here at Purdue Calumet, published much and comments often, bringing the complex concepts of philosophy to make sense in how do we evaluate choices we make in our daily life. This is going to be a different format because neither one of us are going to talk about our published work directly. Although David's work in ethics and my work in media framing, we're going to try to bring that together in a conversation about a topic that probably appears as common sense to most of the public, but I'd like to bring a little controversy to that. That is ISIS in the news, the Islamic State, and the response of the United States government or the coalition of the willing. Most of you probably know about ISIS because you've watched the news. I think that I would say, David, I wanted to start with a couple claims that we make about the news media. The first is that we say that all messages are constructions. All messages have an intent and a purpose, and all messages use certain conventions. In the case of the media, there's a heavy emphasis on visuals, spectacles, rolling news, not a lot of background content. In my reading of the coverage of ISIS, besides the outrage or the barbarism you might feel towards it, it strikes me that the media has chosen to make this an event that we are supposed to respond to in almost a predetermined way. You see the beheading of 2 U.S. journalists and, oh my gosh, this is terrible, we have to do something about this. And I put it in the context of just a week ago, I should say a week before the beheadings were shown, the polls show that 65% of the American people were in favor of reducing the military budget. But with the beheadings, suddenly we're fearful again, we're anxious again, we're outraged again, and this creates a response from the public. I guess my question, and it may be a little provocative, but it's a question that I've been wondering. What makes something like a beheading less ethical or more barbaric than a drone attack or an F-15 fighter or a jet plane or bombing indiscriminately a village to get at some? How do we get around the ethic of that?
Well, a couple of things I'd say. One is it's not just the issue of a beheading versus a drone attack. A big issue is it an American victim or someone else?
Good point.
And I'm thinking, for example, in the aftermath of the atrocities of September 11th, 2001, newspapers, probably people watching will remember this, on a daily basis they would have some profiles of Americans who were killed in those attacks, giving you information about their lives. Here's someone's job, here's the kids they had, here's the volunteer work they did, etc. So that they're very much humanized and you can really feel the tragedy of it. Whereas people, innocent bystanders who are sometimes killed in these drone attacks, they aren't humanized. And with regard to the beheading issue, as I'm sure you're aware, Saudi Arabia, whom we support, they engage in beheading. Recently they had some public beheadings for the crime of sorcery.
Yes.
And for that matter, the so-called Syrian moderates that President Obama is talking about funding, they have beheaded some ISIS fighters they've had. So I think it's not so much a beheading versus a drone attack thing. It's more, are the victims Americans versus non-Americans? That's my sense of it.
Okay, so it isn't, I think the point you made about Saudi Arabia is interesting because, yes, I mean, this year Saudi Arabia beheaded 70 plus people, including in public, including leaving the bodies out in public display as a deterrent. But the U.S. media doesn't have outrage about that.
Right.
So the argument is essentially that it's the fact that it's a U.S. person that was beheaded. If it would have been the British, there may have been some outrage because it wasn't a Saudi, but when it's an American, it's more, there's kind of a calculus as you get closer to the home country where the media's coverage, more outrage comes.
Well, right, and also there's the factor of Saudi Arabia being theoretically a U.S. ally. So you don't have powerful people in politics, for example, wanting to call a lot of attention to their human rights abuses, whereas official enemies there is, and the media, responds to that also. So that's another factor in that, I think.
One of the stories that didn't get raised to prominence, but right the day or two after Foley, when he was killed, the parents were distressed because ISIS had asked for a ransom. And a number of people that had been kidnapped by ISIS and other similar groups in northern Syria and Iraq had asked for ransom, and ransom was paid, and the people were freed. Mm-hmm. But the U.S. position is nobody negotiates with terrorists because it just encourages that kind of behavior. So again, I wonder what is the argument, or what is the ethic of telling Foley's parents, no, you can't free your son, even if you have the thousands of dollars that are necessary to free him, because this is something bigger than your son.
Yeah, well, as a parent myself, I take a dim view of that. It seems to me the government can run foreign policy, but I don't know that they have a right to dictate, an exchange that someone might do in order to get their child back. I mean, it seems to me.
Well, they were threatened with arrest and prosecution,
right? Yeah.
If they continued to try to free their son without going through the official channels, which basically meant that he was going to be killed.
Which happened.
Which is what happened.
Yeah.
Another thing that comes in the media, I consider it a myth, but one of the things that's almost a drumbeat in the media, I've been looking at the television news primarily, and this is primarily where it comes out, is that ISIS, the Islamic State, poses an immediate threat to the United States. And this isn't just something that the Obama administration says, or something that a senator from Florida will say, but this is what the media themselves will say. Bob Schieffer on Face of the Nation, in his interview, starts with, ISIS is a direct threat to the United States. David Muir on ABC said, the risk of a terror attack is more threatening than any time before 9/11. In fact, ISIS, because they use social media, is more of an immediate threat than Al-Qaeda ever was. Terry Moran on ABC says that ISIS is a direct threat to the American homeland. On NBC, Brian Williams, in his September 11th comments, says that the United States has to respond with air attacks. So there's this presentation, the framing by the media largely, which accepts I would argue, the administration's position that if the United States doesn't do something militarily, the next thing you know, there'll be a beheading here in Hammond. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the way that it plays out.
Yeah.
I guess the question is how do we make sense out of 13 years of war, where you start with Al-Qaeda, a disoriented, relatively minor group, 13 years in with the $4 million in, and we have now a plethora of groups everywhere, all the way to Nigeria and the Sudan and ISIS, and the Taliban has a resurgence in Afghanistan, and in Iraq there's almost a defunct state. I mean, so the argument is that there has to be a response, because if we don't, we get bigger. But I'm wondering about the logic of what we've learned from 13 years of saying, well, it's almost like a whack-a-mole, you knock this down and 3 pop up. Where is the logic or the I guess the requirement that we have a discussion about the effects of certain actions?
Well, right. There isn't a discussion, and there should be. I mean, it seems to me if we can learn from history, we would learn that the militaristic approach to these sorts of problems not only does it not work, it makes the problem worse because it creates more resentment, more hatred. It's a great recruitment tool for these terrorist organizations. That's probably why they have Western narrators for their videos and so forth. They're trying to provoke a Western military response because that's their best recruitment tool. And in the case of Iraq, there wasn't a presence of al-Qaeda in Iraq prior to the U.S. War there, but in the wake of that, now al-Qaeda is there, and you have ISIS as a spin-off from that. But there's not any kind of discussion of history, as you're pointing out. I mean, the fact that al-Qaeda came into being in Afghanistan in the late 70s in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and it was funded and trained by the U.S. intelligence and Pakistani intelligence. And they're sort of proud of that. I've seen Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski quite recently talking about how proud they are of how they handled that. And there's sort of not any kind of discussion about how, well, wait a minute, it turned into al-Qaeda, and so forth. So, yeah, we don't like history. President Obama, when he took office and he was asked about whether he was going to prosecute Americans who engaged in torture, because as you know, he recently admitted that, as he put it, we tortured some folks. But when he first became president, he was asked about that, and he says, no, we're not going to do that, because I prefer to look forward rather than backward. And my thought is, well, that's like saying I prefer to breathe in and not breathe out. I mean, if you're going to be an intelligent human being, yes, you have to look forward, but you also have to look at what history teaches us. That's how we learn how the world works.
I guess the question is, what does history teach us, and how do we know that history teaches us this? I mean, the majority of Americans, we receive our news on the nightly news. We may receive our news by reading the daily newspaper, or just as likely we receive it through YouTube or Facebook. So, I mean, how does the construction of history get made in here, I guess, and what is the obligation to share some of the information you're talking about so that, a rational discussion, a rational decision can be made?
Well, I mean, that's, I think, more in your field than in mine, but my thought is that, yeah, the mass media don't do a good job of this. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why they perform the way they do. You would know more about that than I would, but I would say one has to look to other sources to get this kind of information.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back, and I'll try to explain what I'm asking here, because I want more of your comment on
Sure.
it. So thank you. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to the second half of Calumet Perspectives. I'm your host for this show, Lee Artz. I teach media studies. My guest is David Detmers from the Department of Philosophy. We're discussing ISIS and the U.S. Response to ISIS, the military response to ISIS. We don't expect to reach any definitive conclusions here. We hope to have some questions that all of the viewers and the citizens can consider as they're moving forward. I just wanted to make a comment, David, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, I guess.
Sure.
When we, you and I, or citizens or friends that we know talk about the world, we'll say we did this and we do that. It always troubles me when we, you and I and the citizens of the world refer to U.S. actions as if it's something that we did. So when you say, before you said, when we were in Iraq or we had the war in Afghanistan, and I'm always reluctant to take that step because I feel like unless, 150 million voters actually decided, actually had the information and made the decision, it's not really fair to say we are in Afghanistan. On the other hand, there seems to be a certain responsibility that we have as citizens to understand what's going on in the world and what's being done in our name, but I don't really have a ready answer of how to deal with this. So my question for you is, what's the level of responsibility we have for actions that are taken in our name with information that either is misinformation or disinformation or just incomplete information? Is that?
Yeah. I'll say a couple things about that. I mean, one is that people have to realize that the information you get from the mass media is very incomplete and very much distorted. Again, this is more in your field than in mine, but I'll say a couple things about it. There's a wonderful book by Ben Bagdakian called The Media Monopoly. And I remember when the first edition came out, I think it was 1982. And he had a list of the biggest 500 media outlets in the country, counting television networks and stations, radio stations, magazines, newspapers, etc. And they were all owned by something like, 22, 23 corporations. And the book's gone through through several editions, and with each new edition, it's a smaller number of corporations that owns them all. I think it's now something like 7 corporations own the 500 biggest media outlets. So there's a pseudo-diversity. We're not getting a real diversity of ideas about the news in the mass media. So I think people want to be a responsible citizen if they want to be informed about what their country is doing so they can lend their voice in support or opposition. They have to take some responsibility for seeking out information from other sources. And these would be things like media from other countries, non-mass media outlets in the U.S., scholarly publications, books, reports by human rights organizations like Amnesty International, the International Red Cross. I know it makes it sound like a big research project, but when it comes to something serious like going to war, I think it's important to be well informed, and I would argue citizens have an obligation to inform themselves.
I don't want to let people off the hook, but to me it seems to be a difficult prospect.
Well,
you work all day.
Yeah, that's right.
You're trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, you're right.
You see something like the beheading. I mean, what's there to discuss? I saw it. It happened.
Right.
It shouldn't happen. We can't let this go on. Let's move forward.
But on the other hand, I mean, it seems to me there is a failure to exert appropriate effort. I'm thinking of, for example, back in the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, when the U.S. government was supporting the government of El Salvador and opposing the rebels there, and just the reverse in Nicaragua, opposing the government and supporting the rebels there. And someone did a wonderful poll of American citizens where they simply asked them to identify which side are we on in these two countries. And very, very few people knew. And what was interesting is 100% of the people who actually got it right in both countries opposed U.S. policy. So anyone who actually looked into it enough even have that much information, you see. So how much effort does it take to find out a little bit more about the world than what you get in the mass media? I think it is doable, even people who work hard.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's impossible. I mean, we live in an information-rich society, and
Yes.
you can Google ISIS, you can Google beheadings, and you can find this.
Yeah.
But again, I think that the culture in which we live encourages not to do that.
Oh, absolutely.
Encourages us to watch the Ultimate Fight Club or
Absolutely.
football. I think we increasingly live in a society where we're asked to do what we're supposed to do, like nodding and saying yes, and and being to work on time, and if you deviate from that, you may not get the promotion, you may not get the grade in the class. It just strikes me that it's a fragile system. I agree, the media, there's a handful of news media. But the reason we have 24-hour news, because it is such a fragile system that a little bit may sneak out, and you may actually come to this conclusion that what I'm being told should be suspect, or the policy that I'm asked to support is suspect. It just strikes me that universities, for one, have a bigger obligation to address this rather than simply what's in the textbooks. So the 7 steps of doing a good advertising campaign may be added with an 8th step. Should I be doing this advertising campaign? Right. So if you watch the media, it's all about, well, a military operation work, but it's not a question, should there be a military operation?
And just to add on to that, there's almost never any kind of question about whether it's lawful, for example, whether it's consistent with international law. I mean, for example, this business of funding the so-called moderate Syrian fighters, well, you know, if you fund a proxy army, that's still aggression. And if they commit acts of terrorism, that's international terrorism. And President Obama, in his speech, he was talking about how we're going to follow ISIS wherever they go. We're going to drop bombs wherever they are. So the idea of running around dropping bombs in countries all over the planet, that's illegal. You know, but there's no discussion of that in the mass media. So it's very Orwellian. There are things that are just off the agenda, and they're not discussed, even though anyone who's independent-minded would see them as important questions to ask.
I agree with you, and I don't. In fact, I'm quite optimistic, because I think the ability of the American public and the rest of the citizens of the world to make change is phenomenal.
I agree.
I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen things like the end of apartheid, the end of the war in Vietnam. You've seen the Arab Spring, so I understand this, which, as a person that studies the media, I recognize the role that the media has to try to prevent that from happening. I also see the kind of the merging of the media and the government to make sure that this doesn't happen, so that we have an increasingly, I don't know, for lack of a better word, militarized culture. Everything from being in a permanent war, which we've been in now for 13, 14 years, we have students in our classes that have known nothing except the U.S. being at war somewhere. You have the militarization of our own police force. You see that with the things that came out with the shooting in Ferguson, and the tanks and the arms that belong in war are in the hands of local police. I think that you see that with the loss of our civil liberties. Everything from the right to assemble in certain places, frisk searched at the airport, surveillance of your personal conversation on the phone. If you're black or Latino or Arab, you're profiled when you drive down the street. And then on top of that, fitting within that, is an entertainment media that gives us superheroes after superheroes after superheroes that protect us from this terrorist threat of evil. The striking thing to me is it's not enough. We can still see through it. I mean, it's not enough. So you use both the coercion and the attempt to win some kind of modulated support for some action. It still doesn't appear to be enough. But I'm still not ready to take the step to hold people responsible that don't know, that don't have the motivation to hold them responsible for actions that are done in their name that they're not fully aware of.
Well, I mean, I would say that responsibility is a matter of degree. It's not an all or nothing thing. In other words, people who didn't vote for it, didn't support it, don't have the same responsibility as the people actually executing it. So it's a matter of degree, I would say.
I guess the big question is, whose interest is this in? Because if we're making this, we're kind of
Yeah,
agreeing
yeah.
here that it doesn't really reflect the interests of civil rights or the average citizen.
Right.
People are going to die. It certainly isn't in the interests of the Iraqis or the Syrians or
Right.
the refugees. Well, how can we step back? Because it has to be more than a political calculation of this Republican or that Democrat.
Well, yeah, I think this business of permanent war that you're talking about, the militarization of culture of the whole society, that's something that benefits the 1%, so to speak. Big corporations, a very large number of them are involved in the weapons industry, and that's often done on a kind of no-bid basis. There are huge profits in it. Those are the people who fund the elections. So, politicians, it's in their interest to have this going. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that they are insincere about wanting to fight against a group like ISIS, because I think they are trying to also make the world hospitable to corporate practices and so forth. But if they're not able to defeat these people, having these enemies around is also good, because it leads to this militarization, which also leads to this increased control that you're talking about with all the surveillance and the Patriot Act and so on.
Another whole question,
Yeah.
another topic for another
Sure.
Calumet Perspectives. So, and this would be one place I think people can find questions, maybe not answers to the questions, but thank you for watching. I invite you to tune in again next week to see Calumet Perspectives and our guest at that time. Thank you. My name is Lee Artz, and thank you, David, for
My
joining
pleasure.
me today.